Hey guys, I've created this video to follow along with the lobster video, organic shapes video in the description below. So go ahead and open a new design and name it your name's lobster. So you're going to go to the drop down where you see basic shapes and instead go to shape generators, featured. So featured shape generators, and you're going to find the extrusion shape. Pull that onto your canvas. So the extrusion shape is where you can manipulate it to kind of be an organic shape in and of itself with those little circles and squares. And we'll talk about that more in a second. For now, go back to the drop down menu and we're going to find the egg under characters. So find characters and then find the egg and pull it in. That's our first step. Then once you have the egg pulled in, we're going to duplicate it. Both the egg and the extrusion I'm going to duplicate eventually. You can always do the duplication button up top there on the left, or actually do Control D or Command D depending if you have a PC or a Mac. So I'm duplicating both, and then with my egg I'm going to follow along with the video to make the initial shape of the body of the lobster. Sizes right now don't matter, specific sizes that is, because we're not going to be printing this lobster, but you're just trying to get the general shape, the kind of long egg and smaller egg shape that combines for the body and head of this lobster. And then we're going to play with the angles until it looks about where we want it. So one important thing to do is to check it from different angles, different perspectives, and make sure that they're lined up and sized the way you want them. My body was pretty skinny in comparison to my head, and then later on my head got too skinny in comparison to my body, so you're checking from different directions. Also using the align tool. So pay attention to the little orange pop-ups on which ones it's going to align. I want it to align up on that vertical stance right there. That's the middle I want it to align on, nothing else right now. I'm changing the speed on this next little clip here because it's just me going in and making sure from different angles, different perspectives, that I'm happy with the sizing and the alignment on my head and body of my lobster. Now we're going to move on to the extrusion tool. So when you move the little squares or the tangents, you can change the shape of the extrusion to have these rounded edges. So I'm doing kind of this little moon shape here. And I'm going to pull out the actual shape because what I'm going to do is create a hole with this extrusion shape that is going to basically carve out the bottom of my lobster. So you've got to imagine kind of the negative space, the part of your object that you don't want before you make your extrusion. So I don't want everything outside of this curve on the inner side of the moon. So that's what I'm working with here. I'm trying to make it a nice, gentle sloping curve so that whenever I turn this around and fit it right underneath my lobster, that I can not have too many hard edges. So as you can see, I've made it a hole and I've elongated it so it's going to fit under the entire body of the lobster. And I'm going to angle it upward just like my lobster is angled upward. Again, it's not a specific angle that I'm looking for. It's more just making sure it looks like how you want it to look. You're cutting off the bottom of our lobster. So at what slope do you want the bottom of the lobster? So that's what you have to play around with, getting the angle just right, getting the sizes just right, and making sure you're always checking it from every different perspective. If you want to use the align tool to make sure it's perfectly centered, you can. But as you move around your hole, you're going to see the shadowed part is what's going to be cut off. So you have to make sure you're not leaving anything kind of like a wonky edge hanging off the front or back, or sides if you were working with a different one. But in this particular example, I had to make it longer so the back wouldn't get cut off as well. And as you saw, I had to align it to make it centered. And now I'm going to select all of the shapes and group them so that I have that bottom portion cut off. Next, I'm going to start working on the scales on the back of the tail. So I'm going to duplicate that extrusion tool, so I always have an extra, and again make my sort of half moon type of shape. Once I get the shape, I turn it over so that the curved end kind of fits on top of the body of my lobster, and I'm going to take a look at the image of a lobster that he's working from, and you can see the edges of that lobster's scales are kind of pointed. They curve inward on the back and outward on the front. So what he does is he uses those extrusion shapes to make the cutouts of the inward cut and the outward curve. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to need 2 more extrusions, and we're going to make those cuts, those holes, using a curve we made with the extrusion. I find it's easiest if you work one at a time, so I'm going to duplicate the extrusion shape and drag it off to the side and do that first curved on the left side, or at least from my perspective, the left side of that scale that I've already made. So I made the half moon, and I'm going to make it a hole, and I'm going to turn it so that that inward curve of the moon is going to be cutting off the outside of that scale on the left side. So again, there's no specific angle that I'm looking for. You just want to play with it in terms of the half moon that you made and watching the shadowed part that you see is going to be cut off to see what makes the best, more natural cutout for your scale. Always remember to check it from different perspectives. Make sure it's touching everywhere you want it to touch. It's big enough, it's angled correctly, and then group it. Then we're going to do the same thing to the other side. So of course you're going to need to duplicate your extrusion tool again, and according to his video, this one's going to be a little different. So this is the first time we're not making that half moon shape. We're making a kind of S shape. So on your circle for the extrusion, you pull one side up of the circle to the left and one side down to the right, and then you can mess with the boxes on the left and right and the circles, which are the tangents, to kind of shape the S. So you have to play with it a little bit to get this backwards S shape and get it kind of how you want it, and then you make it a hole, turn it around, shape it against that other edge of the scale, that right side, because that's the side we want to cut out now. And again, you're working with whatever angles look best to you, double checking all of the different perspectives, making sure you're cutting everything you need to, and then when you're ready to, go ahead and group them so you have that nice pointed edge to your scale. Then it's time to put it at the back of your lobster because we're going to start forming our tail. So check different perspectives, make sure it fits your lobster and is about the right size that you want it to be proportionally to your lobster. And then once you get it right, we're going to use a special feature with the duplication tool where you duplicate it and then pull it out and change the angle so that it curves downward or angles down a little bit more. And then whenever you press duplicate again, what's going to happen is Tinkercad will remember exactly how many degrees you pulled it out and how many degrees you angled that duplication, and it's going to continue pulling it out and angling it even more. So you just have to do Control D or Command D or the duplicate button about 4 or 5 times until you get the number of scales that you want, and it's going to automatically pull them down for you. The very last thing after that, before we conclude this video for today, is to make sure that the scales get smaller as they go down, because if you look at a real lobster tail, it's going to get smaller and smaller and kind of taper off towards the end of the tail. So this one I just did manually. I shrunk it down a little bit on the length or width, of each scale, a few millimeters each time until I had it kind of at a tapered end. Stay tuned for part 2.